This is the Before You Read lecture on the book of Exodus. The place to begin this introductory video on Exodus is with the title of this second book in the Bible. In Christian tradition, this book is known as Exodus. The English title Exodus comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which literally refers to this book as the way out. A fuller version of the Greek title would be something like The Way Out of Egypt. In Jewish tradition, this book is known as Shemot, or names, based on the very first words of the first verse. These are the names of the sons of Israel. The two titles reflecting two religious traditions highlight important aspects of the writing. First, the title Exodus, or The Way Out of Egypt, points to God's redemption of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt and God's presence with them as they journey toward the Promised Land. But names is also important. As Old Testament scholar Brent Strawn points out, this book focuses on three important names or characters. Israel, who transitions from an extended family to a people or tribe. Moses, who plays a central role in the events described in the book. And most importantly, God, who self-identifies early in the narrative and teaches the people of Israel and the reader who God is through action, presence, and instruction for common life together. I've already mentioned that this is the second book of the Bible, the second of 5 books known as the Pentateuch. But if you just pick up a Bible and start reading Exodus 1, you may wonder, how did we get here? The final chapters of Genesis really provide the backdrop for Exodus. In Genesis 46 through 50, the Joseph story comes to an end. Joseph and his brothers make up. Joseph's dad comes to Egypt for a time before his death. And Joseph's extended family of about 70 move to Egypt. They're given some of the best land in the region, and they make a home for themselves there. Jacob, or Israel as he is known, and his family are in Egypt. This is the backdrop of Exodus. But things quickly change as you read Exodus. The extended family grows into a great group of people. The supreme leader in Egypt, once friendly with Joseph and his family, is increasingly threatened by their presence and inflicts backbreaking work and even genocidal schemes against Israel as a result. Exodus opens with a partial fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and the other patriarchs. This dysfunctional family has grown into a great people, but they have not yet come to dwell in the land that God has promised. In order to get Israel to that land, God must bring them out of Egypt first. Biblical scholars suggest that the oppression of the people of Israel described in Exodus may have happened during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II, who reigned from around 1290 to 1224 BCE. There is a mention of Israel on a stela from around 1230 BCE, and this may provide some support to this suggestion. But as with the book of Genesis, the material found in Exodus represents years of remembering, retelling, and reinterpreting the central events it describes. Scholars suggest that Exodus began to take written form as early as the 7th century, with edits and additions being made as late as the 5th century BCE. Like the Bible as a whole, Exodus is an anthology of sorts. While the majority of Exodus consists of third-person narrative, Exodus includes other types of literature, including poetry in chapter 15 and the legislation of social and religious laws in the second half of the book. We might also add the special descriptions of God's presence, or what scholars refer to as theophanies, as a distinct portion of this writing. Despite the presence of different types of literature in it, Exodus does tell a single story of Israel's national origin and God's intervention that makes this a possibility. In his introduction to Exodus in the New Interpreter Study Bible, Thomas Dozeman helpfully divides Exodus into 2 parts, with each part teaching the reader something about God. The first part, Exodus 1:1 through 15:21, describes the growing conflict between God and Pharaoh, which ultimately leads to Israel's redemption at the sea. This section of Exodus focuses on the power of God, especially in comparison to the assumed power of Pharaoh. The 10 plagues figure prominently in these chapters and clearly demonstrate this contest between Pharaoh and God. The second part, Exodus 15:22 through 40:38, recount God's guidance of the people of Israel as they journey toward the Promised Land. This section focuses on the continued presence of God. We can also highlight distinct moments in this second part of Exodus that are worth noting at the beginning. The giving of the law at Mount Sinai in chapters 19 through 24, the giving of the blueprints for the tabernacle in chapters 25 through 31, the golden calf incident in chapter 32, and the construction of the tabernacle in chapters 35 through 40. Old Testament professor Brent Strawn suggests that Exodus is not only the most important book in the Pentateuch, but perhaps the most important book in the Bible. That sounds super important, but I wonder why he thinks this is the case. In the first place, Exodus really is the starting point for Israel as a people or a tribe. While not quite the nation of Israel that will be ruled by the likes of David or Solomon or the other kings that are mentioned in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Israel in Exodus is more than a large family. They become a large and apparently distinctive people group living in the midst of the Egyptians. The events of Exodus will only increase that distinctiveness, as God's powerful intervention and specific instructions for life together are intended to set Israel apart from her neighbors. Israel becomes Israel through Exodus. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Exodus marks a clear shift in the people of Israel's religious understanding. There's a shift from understanding God as one God among the pantheon of powerful deities to a more exclusive allegiance to the one God alone. Early in Exodus, God reveals the divine name to Moses. Jewish tradition does not pronounce this name, but it basically means that God will be who God is. Or, to put it another way, God will be made known through God's actions. The people of Israel and we readers learn about this God through the actions of God referred to in the book of Exodus. Third, Exodus provides the definitive act of redemption in all of the Bible. The psalmists celebrate and remember the events of Exodus in their poetry. The author of Isaiah describes the Israelites' return from exile as a sort of new Exodus. And notably, the Gospels make important connections between the death and resurrection of Jesus and the Passover, and the events of the other events of the Exodus. For liberation theology, the events of Exodus are the defining aspects of God's character and actions in and for the world. Finally, a brief word about Moses. Moses is definitely one, if not the, central character in the book. The early chapters of Exodus offer clues into his early years, like his birth and his upbringing in the house of Pharaoh. In his leadership of the people of Israel later in his life, he takes on important roles. He acts as a savior or a liberator of the Israelites in the first half of Exodus. And then he acts as Israel's mediator, a go-between between God and the people of Israel in the second half of the book. In some ways, Moses offers something like a template of important roles that develop later in Judaism, including that of the priest, the prophet, and the scribe. Moses and the story of Exodus more generally have been popularized in films like The Ten Commandments and The Prince of Egypt. Individual episodes fill children's Bibles and decorate felt boards in Sunday school rooms. As you read, try to notice details that you may have overlooked in the past. Pay attention to the rough edges that maybe have been smoothed out in popular retellings. Keep in mind how Moses and the people of Israel are characterized. Who are they, and what are they becoming through their pursuit of the God who redeemed them and leads them to their promised future. And above all, what kind of God is the God of Exodus? In his textbook, The Bible, in Introduction, Jeremy Sumney offers this description of Exodus. Since the Exodus story is not objective history, but a theological narrative, it is designed to reveal who God is and how God acts among God's people and throughout the world. So pay attention to what you learn about God in this theological narrative that is Exodus. Happy reading.